Welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and on podcast on all major platforms. I'm Paul Smith, host of Food Farm Talk. Please follow our podcast and our social media feeds. Today you'll hear an episode of Stories of Regeneration, a podcast series by Regeneration Canada, based in Montreal, Quebec, and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions, based in Stettler, Alberta, with funding from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. We thank Regeneration Canada and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions for permission to air this episode. Enjoy.
Yeah, that's always the challenge, isn't it? We're talking about pretty radical change.
Yep.
And radical change is not easy. It also won't happen just by farmers doing things differently. And this is, again, where that community and partnerships comes in, that we need to not only be doing the piece on the land and innovating new ways of producing and really thinking about what that ecosystem looks like and how we steward it, we have to also be engaged at the community level. We can, I always say, we can do an amazing job at training students to be the most fantastic farmers that know all the regenerative practices and just steward the land amazingly. But if society doesn't also hold value in that, boy, you're facing an uphill battle. And I think that's kind of where we're sitting now, right? Where we know that this is where we need to go. And there's lots of great farmers that are doing it. But boy, we put a lot on the farmers to sort of make it happen. And I think when you look at conventional farmers or farmers that maybe haven't quite come down that regenerative road, it's not because they are anti-regenerative and sustainability practices, right? It's that they're probably really stretched, and that jump is a gigantic jump that they can't quite visualize, and it is asking a lot for them to make that jump. And so it's a slow build, and it is something that you need to have scaffolding around people so that they can make that shift. It's very unfair to go to a farmer that has been doing something one way for decades and say, hey, guess what? We're in a new place now. We've learned all kinds of things and we need to change the way we're doing things. Here's the book on how to do it.
Right.
Off you go. And not come alongside and not really recognize what that means in terms of dollars and cents, in terms of expertise. So there's a lot of pieces to it. And there's policy that needs to change. There's training that needs to happen. There's changes in land use that needs to happen. And structures of our food system from the distribution side needs to happen. I mean, we're talking about systemic change. And that's not easy. So what's the big shift? It really is, and I think part of the way we've gotten here is the fact that so many people in sort of what I would say the non-agricultural side of society have disconnected from it, and they have no concept of it. And so the world proceeds and goes on, and policies change with no concept of how that influences the food system. Well, we need that piece. That's a really big piece of it. So having all people in society actually start to understand what this is about, that it is, yes, we absolutely need to train and empower and support farmers, but we need to make sure that the community around those farmers, society as a whole, is starting to wrap their heads around, we need to re-engage with our food system and actually understand what's happening here, because we're going to go to society and say, you need to be part of this. It doesn't work if they're not. This isn't something farmers can do alone. And I think it's unfair to expect farmers to do it alone. So that for me is a really big piece of it, is engaging in dialogue with the rest of society that is not currently engaged in agriculture, right? That, hey, this discussion is bigger than you could ever imagine, but it's really exciting and it's amazing. There's so much cool stuff here, and we're starting to see it. There's been a pretty big shift towards a more conscientious eater and consumer. Absolutely. We can do a lot more. And there's a lot to build on there, which is exciting. But to me, I think there needs to be just as much effort being put on that side of really engaging with society as a whole about why this matters and why this is part of our way forward. And it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have, at the same time as we empower and train and equip farmers to do it that way as well. It's got to be both, and they have to happen simultaneously. So.
Rural Roots to Climate Solutions, in partnership with Regeneration Canada, presents Stories of Regeneration, a podcast series exploring why we, as a society, need to get behind the farmers and ranchers who are regenerating the land, ecosystems, and local economies through their agricultural principles and practices. Farmers and ranchers who are striving for great things through regenerative agriculture. Part 8, Partners in the Ecosystem, with Rebecca Harbut and Michael Bomford of KPU Farm in Richmond, British Columbia, October 19th, 2023.
Welcome to Kwantlen Polytechnic University. We're really thrilled to have the opportunity to share our story and to just talk about what we're doing here. And I would just love to start with the respectful acknowledgement that we at Kwantlen Polytechnic University live, work, and study in a region that overlaps with the unceded, traditional, and ancestral First Nations territories of the Musqueam, the Katzie, the Semiahmoo, the Tsawwassen, the Kekwat, the Coquitlam, and the lands of the Kwantlen First Nation, which gifted its name to our university. So I'm Rebecca Harbut. I'm one of the faculty here at Kwantlen's Sustainable Agriculture Program.
So my name is Michael Bomford. I live right here in Richmond, and I teach at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in the Department of Sustainable Agriculture.
So awesome to have a land acknowledgement right at the start of an episode. I'm Derek Leahy, host of the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions podcast. Welcome back to the Stories of Regeneration series. And I'm sad to say this, but in these final 3 episodes of the series, we'll be doing some light exploration into the relationship between society and regenerative agriculture and how one can help advance the other. But the real meat and potatoes of the last 3 episodes, just like all the other episodes in the series, is that we're going to get to know and understand the boots on the ground folks who are leading the way on this change that we're seeing in the agriculture sector. Rebecca and Mike of Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Richmond, BC are some of those folks. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, wait a minute, how can they be boots on the ground folks if they're university professors? Well, first of all, KPU is a university with the farm, and the farm is at the center of the work that Mike and Rebecca do. Second, and this has come up a few times on the series, that comes up often in the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions podcast too. Canada's population is reaching 40 million, and only around 250,000 of those people are farm and ranch operators, and an additional approximately 250,000 people in that big number of 40 million are farm laborers. Agriculture producers are just over 1% of the population. If there's one lesson you're going to take away and learn from this particular episode, it's going to take a whole bunch of us. So those of us who don't fall into those categories of farm operators and farm laborers, it's going to take a whole bunch of us partnering with that over just 1% of the population to help pave the way for regenerative agriculture to go from practice by a few to practice by many.
So I grew up the son of a district agriculturalist up in the North Peace region of British Columbia. And my parents were homesteaders. They started trying to farm. It was not entirely successful. So I saw that process. When I left home, I did a degree in plant science at the University of British Columbia and had all sorts of opportunities to work in various agricultural enterprises and kind of ended up specializing in agricultural pest management. I did a master's in pest management and then worked as a consultant on fruit and vegetable farms in the Fraser Valley here. And then I went off to West Virginia where I did a PhD working on a land-grant university farm that was transitioning to organic agriculture. So that was kind of my introduction to organics, and that became my specialty. I went and worked in Kentucky for 10 years at Kentucky State University, and I was the state specialist for organic agriculture there.
And yeah, how did you get involved in the project that's going on here?
Well, I came here because my parents live in Victoria, so I was looking for an opportunity to move closer to home and closer to my parents. And in Kentucky, there was a lot of exciting stuff going on. I had a combination of research and teaching and extension responsibilities. And although it was all fascinating and exciting, it was also overwhelming. It's hard to do 3 jobs well. So when I came here, it seemed like an opportunity to really focus on the teaching. This is a teaching-centric university, and I really enjoy teaching and wanted to have that opportunity. But it's a cool opportunity too, in that this is really hands-on education. So I get to keep farming as we teach, and I feel like that's a really nice combination. I've really enjoyed my time here.
But I very much grew up in the city and actually had no intention of ever getting into agriculture. I started studying to be a physiotherapist and was sort of interested in the health world. And through a whole series of events, I ended up working in a horticultural therapy program and just started to see... we worked with Alzheimer's patients, actually, and would be out in the garden with them. And it was amazing to see how they would just come alive when they were working in the garden and smelling the plants and just digging in the soil. And I've always loved gardening. So as a kid and when I lived at home, I was the one that was always outside in the garden and loved doing that. And it was sort of like, this is a really big component of health. So I actually started to study plant science. I went to the University of Guelph, and while I was there, one of my professors, Al Sullivan, was like, you should do some research with me. Like, it'll be great. We'll do research on strawberries. And he really got me hooked on research and and plant physiology and just how amazing plants are. And so I did my master's with him and then went to Cornell to do my PhD. I had the chance to go down there. And while I was there, really had the opportunity to engage with a vibrant community that had this amazing food culture that was there, and lots of exciting things happening around regional food systems. And just a really great space that opened my eyes to this whole world of, whoa, there's a lot that I haven't thought about and that I really love. And so I continue my studies in fruit, and I still love fruit production. But it really gave me a taste of how much more exciting it is when you also have this community element added into it. I then got a job at the University of Wisconsin, where I was a similar position to what Mike had. I was doing research and teaching, but I was also the state fruit specialist, extension specialist for the state, and worked with a lot of fruit producers that were there. And I loved that job. It was really amazing. I got to work with farmers. But one of the things that frustrated me was what drove a lot of what we did was squarely focused on the production and the yield of more fruit. And kind of sustainability came into it, but a lot of it was kind of tweaking what we're doing to be a little more sustainable. And it was really hard to find those spaces where we could say, whoa, can we just rethink the system? And that was it was frustrating for me, that I kind of oh man, there are other ways we can think about this, and the problems are bigger than this little mole that we're whacking here. It felt like a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole, right? You solve one problem, and then, okay, here's the next problem we're going to solve. And so in 2012, I started talking with Kent Mullinex, actually here. I found out he was starting this program, was really intrigued by the idea. And I was teaching fruit production there as well. And when I was teaching there, I would teach students that never came into an orchard. I never got the chance to work with them in the field and kind of have that experience. It was all book learning. When Kent started talking about this program, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We're starting off at a university that doesn't currently have an agriculture program, which is actually really amazing because there's no baggage that comes with that. There's no existing commitments, and it's something that as a department we've been really cognizant of. You know, we've defined our values, and when someone wants to partner with us or give us money, we say, here are our values, and make sure there's alignment there so that we don't get ourselves trapped. You can very quickly get yourself trapped. And so, yeah, over the course of time, I sort of talked with Kent, and in 2013 I came and was the first faculty in this program, and Mike came the year after. And that was when all the pieces really started coming together for me, where it's like, yes, what does it look like to build something that you're not starting from what exists, you're starting from where do we need to go.
So that's Mike and Rebecca. There's actually one more how did you get involved in agriculture story that we need to hear from in order to understand what's going on at KPU Farm. And that's actually the story from the land, as in how did the land that the KPU Farm is on get involved in agriculture? Interestingly enough, the land is kind of new. People have actually been in the area longer than the land has actually existed.
I think it's really important that we're sitting on an island at the mouth of the Fraser River, the largest of a bunch of islands that formed at the mouth of the Fraser River. And 10,000 years ago, there was no land there. This was we were in the middle of the ocean 10,000 years ago. The glaciers receded, and the river punched through to the coast here and started to deposit sand and silt and clay, and gradually these islands formed. So maybe 5,000 years ago, we would have been on an island, but right at waterfront property where we are sitting right now. And we're just across the street from the farm where we are right now. And now the island has expanded further, but it's that history of deposition and the fact that this land is really new is important to the farm. You know, we find ourselves, well, I should say that the oldest piece of the island is the eastern portion of the island, right? That's where the material was deposited first. And that older portion of the island was where peat bogs started to form. So the eastern half of Richmond is peatlands, and that eastern half is also now in the agricultural land reserve for the most part. The western half is mineral soil, and the western half is mostly developed. It's not in the agricultural land reserve. So although there's a history of farming on the western half, it's now built up. And so we find ourselves, our farm is right at that boundary between the urban built up lands, and we have, you know, skyscrapers around here. We're really in the heart of Metro Vancouver, but we cross the street and we're in open space. We're in the agricultural land reserve. Development has been prevented, and that land has been conserved for agriculture and conservation. And the farm is at the boundary there. It's also at the boundary between the mineral soil and the peat soil. And it's probably worth recognizing that, you know, this is a unique place in which people have been here longer than the land itself. You know, you listen to the oral history of the Musqueam people, they talk about these islands emerging out of the water. And so the people have been living here for tens of thousands of years, and this island is less than 10,000 years old. Wow. So that's where we're farming. We're right at sea level. This entire island was diked by settlers in the late 1800s because it used to flood constantly. The boglands were very, very wet. Everything around here was soggy. And so there's a recent history within the last 150 years of diking and draining, and that has dramatically changed this ecosystem where we farm.
When the program started in 2012, we did not have a farm. We had very little, actually. But Kent Mullinex, who was and still is the director of the Institute for the Sustainable Food System, was really driving the creation of this program. And he had started working with the city of Richmond, which is the city our campus is located in. And in that relationship, they started to identify a parcel of land that could be used for teaching. And so we started on a piece of land that was quite a long ways from campus.
Yeah.
It was really difficult to get to, and actually most of our students don't have cars, so a lot of them are on bikes or on bus, and it wasn't a very accessible piece of property. So we used it, but we ended up doing a lot of our food production on the terraces out in the front of our campus, which actually I'm kind of amazed at how much food we grew on those terraces. It really was quite remarkable. But it didn't allow us to demonstrate sort of the scale of production systems that we really wanted our students to be able to experience. So because we already had this relationship with the city, they knew that we needed something close to our university. The Garden City lands is a piece of property that's right beside our campus, and was a piece of property that the city owned at that time and was really thinking about turning into an agricultural community space. And so we started talking with them about, can we use this site to actually build a teaching and learning and research farm on. So over 5 years, between about 2013 and 2018, we worked with the city, lots of discussions with lots of different stakeholders, and amazingly, we now have a 8-acre certified organic farm. We're expanding up to 20 acres right in the heart of downtown Richmond. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as supportive as the administration at KPU is for our department, they were not really in a position to buy us 20 acres of land in downtown Richmond. So its origin story is also really fascinating, I think, and just speaks to the importance of really finding those shared visions and values with partners, and what you can do when you do come together and sort of see that and identify those shared values. There were certainly tensions along the way, but that ongoing commitment to the outcome and to what we wanted to accomplish really was the big driver that allowed it to happen. So we started farming on that site in 2018, and it's been pretty explosive growth since then on that property, and it's, lots of exciting stuff happening there now.
We farm on a quarter section, so it's a half mile by a half mile of municipally owned property. Mm-hmm. The city purchased that land from the federal government about 10 years ago, and prior to the city purchasing the land and deciding to turn it into a park, it was owned by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, who used it for navigation towers. So there were these towers there. Ships could bounce signals off of the towers and locate themselves to, within a mile or something. It was like an early form of GPS. And then before that, the land was used as a firing range. So back in the 1905 to about the early 1920s, people would come up from Vancouver on the streetcars and spend their days shooting rifles and even heavy artillery across the land where we're farming now. So it's a really, and then we go back further, and Indigenous people, the Kwantlen people to the east, the Musqueam people to the west, the Tsawwassen to the south, would have all used those boglands for harvest of medicinal plants and berries. I mean, these are really important harvest and food lands going way back.
If I vaguely recall from previous conversations, and I know they've been spaced out over a series of months, so forgive me if I'm not remembering things correctly, like there was a contamination issue with the site, and it became either we take everything out or apparently we build a farm for post-secondary students. But maybe you can tell the rest of the story.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's really key to that site. So when the city purchased the property, we were talking to the city about the possibility of farming there. We did a bunch of soil sampling, and we found heavy metals above agricultural thresholds throughout the areas where we sampled. There was copper, and there was lead, and there was mercury, and there were all sorts of nasty things. So we wouldn't have been able to farm that soil directly, even if we had wanted to. The city hired a consultant and said, well, what are we going to do with all this contaminated soil? And the consultant said, well, you can either dig it up and truck it out, or you can layer clean soil on top of it. And so the city chose to do the second, to layer clean soil over top of the native peat that was at that site. Now, as I said, we're right at the edge of the peat bog. So the area where we're farming is on the western portion of the site, and the peat is actually quite shallow there. But even if we had tried to farm that peat directly, we would have lost a lot of it. And I'll talk more about peat bogs and the importance, how agriculture interacts with peat bogs. But by layering the soil over top of the peat, I think the city was actually able to protect it. We're able to farm on this 70-centimeter layer of mineral soil sitting on top of the ancient peat. All of that carbon that's sequestered in the peat remains there, and so we've been able to hold on to the carbon, and now we can actually build more. We can build carbon, we can build soil organic matter, and pull carbon from the atmosphere into that soil. So that's a really important piece of that site. I should say, though, that of the quarter section where we're farming, more than half of it is dedicated to wetland restoration and bog conservation. So the city built a dike that more or less bisects the property, with the largest half on the eastern side being where we're working on restoring that bog and getting the peat growing again. So that's an exciting part of working at that site. Where we farm on the western side, we've got the 8 acres of certified organic land with the mineral soil layered over top of it, and then we're expanding into into a full 20 acres within this next couple of years. And I'll say too that the mineral soil that was layered over there actually came from the airport. We're pretty close to the airport, right, and the airport was they needed to expand their runways, put safety strips at the end of the runways. So that's a little further west than the peatlands. This is all kind of a sandy clay loam. It's a mineral soil that was trucked from the airport to the Garden City lands where we farm. And it was not great soil. It was like 0.5% organic matter when we got it, but it was clean. And so we've been able to dramatically increase the organic matter content and really improve that soil over time. 5 years ago, it was quite a degraded material that we started with, and it's amazing how it's changed since we started.
Yeah, you couldn't tell from looking out there right now. Everything's so lush and green.
No, it's incredible soil now.
One of the 10 principles of regenerative agriculture that the Stories of Regeneration podcast series highlights is the principle of preserving and restoring natural ecosystems. Regenerative practices aim to preserve or claim habitats like peat bogs, wetlands, prairies, and forests. These ecosystems play important roles in the maintenance of the water cycle, the purification of groundwater, sequestering carbon dioxide, cooling the air, and protecting the diverse populations of plants and wildlife that inhabit them. In the case of KPU Farm, so excluding that peat bog that's adjacent to the farm, they've actually created an ecosystem, and they're using regenerative agricultural practices to maintain and preserve that ecosystem. Okay, let's learn about what they've got going on at KPU Farm.
One of the things I'm really excited about is the range of research projects that our students have been engaged in. All of the students who complete our program complete a research project as part of their experience. And they do this over the course of a year. In the springtime, they learn the fundamentals of experimental design and analysis, and I bring in guest speakers from local farms or industry that are serving agriculture, people who have research problems that they need to address. I introduce them to the students, they pitch their problem, and the students choose problems and write up a research proposal in the spring semester. And then in the summer semester, they do their work. So there's all sorts of interesting projects going on. We've had this summer students growing bok choy under solar panels and rice in flooded and unflooded environments. We've got different flowers being used for ground covered around apples, and so all sorts of fascinating things. And then in the fall semester, where they are now, they complete their data collection. They analyze it using all of those statistical tools they learned about in the springtime, and they present their work at a student research symposium at the end of the semester. That all gets archived online, and then the best of those projects end up going to local like ag shows and things like that. So that's kind of, there's always really interesting diversity of things going on through those student research projects at the farm. Another piece of kind of what's happening there is just the infrastructure that we've built. 5 years ago there was nothing there. We've really tried to emphasize infrastructure that allows us to farm in a carbon smart way. Mm-hmm. So for example, we need to produce transplants for our vegetable plots, and we need to get those transplants going pretty early in the springtime. Generally, a lot of the transplants in this area are grown in greenhouses that are heated by natural gas, and that the carbon emissions associated with burning that natural gas for heat end up being a really substantial piece of the life cycle carbon emissions associated with those vegetable crops. So we wanted to demonstrate that you could do something a little bit different. We built a passive solar greenhouse that we use for all our transplant production. It's like this big geodesic dome that's kind of a distinctive feature at the site. And it's been working really, really well. So we're able to grow low carbon transplants without burning any fossil fuels. And then early in the season, those transplants go out to our high tunnels. So that's another passive solar system, just using the heat of the sun there. And these high tunnels are cool because they slide. So we can employ crop rotations where the high tunnel's in one location in the wintertime, and then come springtime, we move it to a different location where we have our warm season crops. And now, actually just today, we moved another tunnel from the place where we had tomatoes for the summertime. Well, they're done now, and we moved it over our winter greens, the kale and the chard and the spinach, those things that we will hope to carry on through the winter months.
Some very good looking kohlrabi in there, by the way.
Yeah.
I was really impressed.
Yeah, no, there's great stuff there. And so those tunnels are just a really interesting piece of infrastructure that are kind of a low input system. There's no heat, there's no artificial light. We're still farming with what nature gives us at the site, but we're just capturing a bit more sunlight and conserving a little bit of heat and extending the season that way.
I think some of the other things going on at the farm that are really exciting are around education and outreach. That is really the heart of what we are there for and what we're doing. And on the outreach side, it's both to our community. So because we're on city property, we're on parkland. And so we have members of our community walking around the perimeter of our farm every day, kind of seeing what's happening there, and just having the opportunity to create and facilitate engagement. People that live in a very urban environment. We've been around the city. It's very densely populated, lots of high rises. There's so many people that don't have the chance to just spend time growing food or just watching the production of food. And so that's a really important piece of what we do there as well, is engaging with the community that just is in our space and kind of trying to welcome them into that space. So one of the things we did this year was create a learning garden that is open to the community all the time. And in that learning garden, we're trying to demonstrate in smaller format all the key things that are happening on the farm. So what are the crops that we're growing, and what are some different production systems that they can come and see and really just touch the plants and smell them and really engage with it in a tangible way, sort of that hands-on piece we can't stay away from at KBU. So engaging with the community is really important. The other piece is educating our students. We're training students in agriculture, but hopefully training them in an agriculture that doesn't exist today, and really thinking about transforming our food system. We can't repeat what we're currently doing. And so a really big piece of it is having our students go through that experience. Their research projects are a great opportunity where they can see, I can have ideas and test them out and demonstrate them and have a meaningful impact and come up with something in the end that has use and actually fills a gap that might be there or innovates a new way of doing something. And that's really empowering for students. Particularly, most of our students don't come from an agricultural background, and to know that that's okay. And you have a really important voice to bring to this. So training up leaders that are experienced in some of these innovative production systems and can kind of have the chance to try their hand at it and see what works and what doesn't. And a big part of what our students do is inform what we do on the farm. You know, our production systems change based on what they bring to the farm. And so, you know, whether it's cultural, you know, we grow new crops that we've never grown before because we have students coming from all over the world that will say, hey, have you ever grown bitter melon? You know, we've got this crazy bitter melon vine growing now and a great market for it, and we wouldn't have grown that otherwise. And so that's a really important piece of it, is empowering students to not be too bound to the way we do it now, but to really imagine how we can do it in the future. So that outreach is a really important piece. And also teaching farmers, what are we doing? We have farmers that come to the farm for field days and can kind of look and learn how to use our production systems and see what we're trying and provide some insights, their insights into that. You know, we do variety trials and sort of working with seed producers, and that interaction with growers is really important as well.
Yeah, it kind of hit me when I was walking around with Alex that sort of the nice thing about a place like this from a like agriculture producer's perspective is like you folks can in some ways take the risks that they can't afford to take.
Absolutely.
Like, there can be like a really great relationship there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's always the challenge for growers, right? Is that producers want to innovate, but it takes time, it takes resources, and that's a lot to ask from producers that are already stretched pretty thin. And so that's a really important role for us that we see, is taking some of that, which is why we go to them and say, hey, what are your questions? What do you want to, if you had all the time in the world, what would you want to figure out? And so it's great. Our students get to then contribute not only to their degree, but to farmers that are out there, and really being able to have that experience of collaborative learning, and that co-creation of knowledge is a really cool experience for them.
I probably repeat myself on this podcast way more often than I'm actually aware of. So forgive me if you've heard this story already. That comes straight out of the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions Regenerative Agriculture Lab that we run out here in Alberta. At one of the lab's workshops a couple years back, I asked a rancher what kind of data would be useful for him to fully and completely transition to regenerative agriculture. His answer was pretty good and straight to the point. What he said was, I just want to know if this stuff works. Agriculture is a risky business, and transitioning to regenerative agriculture can come with its own risks. Remember, it's not like flicking a light switch on and off, going from one system of agriculture to another. Before a farmer or rancher takes the plunge, it would be nice and it would be good to have more places like KPU and more services out there that can provide unbiased advice and data to demonstrate what's likely to work and what's unlikely to work on a given farm or ranch. At this point in the interview, Mike goes over some of the different regenerative agricultural practices they use at the farm.
So I think that the soil building is really a big part of what we do. I told you when we had that mineral soil layered at the site, it was really depleted. It was not a great soil at all. And so it's been fun to just see what we can do with that. We've gone from like 0.5% organic matter to, in places, about 16% organic matter, which is kind of an amazing change in 5 years. And that comes through application of composts and manures, and then a lot of cover cropping wherever we can cover crop in wintertime or summertime. You know, if a piece of land isn't being used for a cash crop, then it goes into cover crops. We're just trying to add as much organic matter to that soil as possible. And it's been exciting to see how quickly the soil has changed. And of course, that represents carbon pulled from the atmosphere that's now stored in the soil, you know, as long as we can maintain that high organic matter content. So I think another thing that we're always thinking about is habitat creation. When we started farming at the site, we built beetle banks around the entire perimeter. So these are like raised, almost like continuous raised beds that go around the property. But the idea is that they're never tilled. So this is perennial habitat for ground nesting beetles, a lot of which are predatory. So we want these beetles to overwinter in these banks and then scurry out into the fields and eat insect eggs and soft-bodied insects and things like that. They, eat our cabbage maggot eggs and our aphids and those sorts of things. So we're really trying to create habitat for those. We also plant those banks with flowering plants and with perennials in order to provide nectar and pollen resources for our native pollinators and for the honeybees that we have at the site as well. So we're really thinking about habitat. We have ponds at the site. There's a big pond adjacent to the site and little ponds that collect all of the runoff from the tunnels into that pond. That creates great habitat for a variety of organisms. And yeah, so we're trying to think about these things. And then I have students trapping beetles so that we can actually monitor the beetle populations. And I had a student doing a beetle trapping project when we first layered the soil, and then this year again they're trapping beetles. It's amazing how much the population has boomed, and there's the diversity has increased, and just the abundance of beetles has increased remarkably over the time that we've been there.
Very cool. Do you have a specific crop rotation here?
We do.
I was mentioned that it was rotate, but I wasn't too sure what the frequency.
So we kind of have the farm divided into, I guess, 4 major sections. Okay. We have what we call our market garden plots, and that's on a 6-year rotation. We have 4 groups of cash crops. So there's a brassica plot every summer, there's a leafy greens plot, there's a root crops plot, and then there's a plot that's dedicated to alliums, beans, and zucchini. It's kind of a mix. It's the
polyculture.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So those 4 plots those 4 groups get rotated through the 6 growing plots. So it'll be 6 years before the root crops plot is root crops again, for example. And 2 of the plots are dedicated to summer cover cropping every year. So that's our 6-year rotation in the market garden plots. In the high tunnel plots, I told you we have these sliding tunnels that allow us to have like a warm season position and a cool season position. We have 3 of these sliding tunnels. Each tunnel can be in 3 positions, and so there are a total of 9 plots that the tunnels move between, and we have those plots on a 9-year rotation. So this summer, for example, in the spot where we had tomatoes inside a tunnel this year, it'll be 9 years until that one's back in tomatoes again. And there's lots of room for cover cropping, summer cover cropping within those plots as well. Over on the east side of the farm is where we have kind of our larger scale, like our field crops. So that's where we would put things like corn and squash and cabbage, things that take more room and maybe aren't as management intensive. And we divide that section into 3 pieces where we'll have, so essentially a 3-year rotation, but it actually ends up being longer because we try to have a couple of years of perennial, it might be alfalfa or something like that, where we're building soil, and then we'll come in with our vegetable crops and then we'll move those vegetable crops over to another section and then over to another section. So it ends up being a fairly long rotation there, with cash cropping of vegetables only being about 1 year in 4.
So how do you avoid, so if you put like alfalfa in 1 year and you want to put like an annual in the next year, how do you avoid did I misunderstand that?
So, the alfalfa would be in for several years. That's why I say that the rotation is longer.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry. Gotcha.
Because typically the alfalfa would be in for, say, 3 years, that's just a wonderful way to build soil organic matter and nitrogen. And so then if you come in after the alfalfa with our annual vegetable crop, it's just a terrific environment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you would just break that, or
exactly?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then beyond that, we have our orchard. And the orchard is just getting established right now. What we have right now is high-density apples, and so they're on a trellis. There will be more high-density plantings going in, and then some lower density, like full-size trees beyond that. And this is some of the diverse tree fruits that Rebecca mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, I think that cropping rotation, when you look at our rotation schedule, it looks like a pretty big Excel mess when you look at the whole farm. But, it is really a critical part of how that farm operates. And the fact that we have lots of different things on that site and the structures like the movable high tunnel, that's a really important part that allows us to have the cropping rotation that we do have. And having cover crops be built into that rotation is also, it can be a really hard thing to decide because it's land that is not in production for that season. And, there's an example where we can start to demonstrate, what is the value of cover cropping? This is not something that is a nice to do. It really is a need to do. And so how do we change that sort of dialogue, especially when you're looking at land, like land values are extremely high here. And so every square meter you want to have in production. And so the temptation is very strong to just use that land. So the chance to have students engage with that and sort of see the importance of crop rotation, see the importance of cover cropping is really critical. So that becomes the norm instead of this is what you should do when you have the opportunity. This is what you should do all the time. This is just part of it. And having a diversified cropping system makes it more complicated, but it also is a really exciting space to be in. There's always things that are happening, and when things go wrong in one space, you've got some bandwidth to sort of absorb things that go wrong in the other space. So that diversity coupled with cover cropping is a real central part of the system that we have operating there. And I think that the other just around soil building, we've had students that have been really interested in no-till systems, and that's something that can be tricky to do in these kinds of diversified cropping systems, smaller scale. How do you start to incorporate no-till then on top of that? And so having plots that are dedicated to cover cropping and kind of having that rotation in place, okay, how do we now layer no-till on top of that? And so that's something we're really digging into, no pun intended, to see how do you integrate that into a pretty complex system already. And we've actually had some pretty great success with that. One of our students did some research looking at no-till cropping systems, and this past summer, he was there, he was working on the farm as one of the farm assistants and really embraced that. And so we've been trying it. And so being able to test out some of these ways of doing on a small scale, intensive, recognizing that we have labor limitations just like every farm does. So that diversity piece is a really important one too, not only in cropping, but cropping systems. So how are we growing things and what are the different types of cropping systems we have across the farm?
With those summer cover crops, you just mow it down, or like as we mentioned earlier, you can't really bring in livestock to graze it off. So is it just mowing it down? Is that the idea, or?
Yeah, we do mow. We'll also cover, so we'll use tarps and just cover the crop, the cover crop, and let it die, let it rot, and then go in, and that's part of the no-till system. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, soil amendments. So what do you folks do since you're organic? Like obviously you can't use what a lot of farmers use, but yeah. So
it's interesting. This is another piece where you think, here we are in an urban environment. There's lots of organic waste here. There is no shortage of organic waste in the city.
There's a facility in the city that takes in organic waste, and then the KPU farm buys it off them. The research, the education, the climate and ecosystem goods and services are all valuable contributions to the community and to society that the KPU farm makes. There's another valuable contribution. It kind of bundles all those up into one neat and tidy package.
So in one of our previous conversations, something that stuck in my mind that actually I think you said it, Rebecca, is like you're hoping to tell, or the university at least is hoping to tell another story, or the other story in the whole agriculture and climate change debate or discussion. I'm just curious what that other story is and why is it important that it's being told here?
Yeah. When we think about what the dialogue is right now around agriculture and climate change and carbon, it really is heavily focused on, well, climate change is coming, how are we going to deal with it? And agriculture's contributing to climate change. And so how can we reduce our contribution to climate change? And these pieces are absolutely relevant and important to think about. The climate is changing fast, and it has really profound impacts on our food production. But I think the other side of that is agriculture hasn't always contributed to climate change. And maybe one of the pieces that we need to add to the dialogue at a higher volume is, how do we grow food and how do we engage in agriculture in a way that actually contributes to the solution of climate change and really enhances what we're doing in terms of stewarding land and stewarding these resources. You know, all that Mike was talking about around peat, that's part of it, where we think, boy, there's a lot we can do that not only sort of gets rid of some of the bad things that are happening in agriculture, but really brings a lot to the table in terms of being a positive force around how we think about our climate and what it looks like going forward. Agriculture should be central to the discussion around what the future looks like if we're actually going to address climate change. That when we think of big changes, and we're talking about some really radical things globally, you know, when we think of shifting from fossil fuels, that's great. That requires big infrastructure changes, and there's a lot that goes into that. We should be having those same discussions in our agricultural sector to say, hey, we can do some radical things in agriculture that, yep, it might look like a totally different system, but we need to engage in that dialogue to see this is a really big component of how globally we fight climate change and how we really can just change the way that relationship. Agriculture is all about land and stewarding ecosystems, and it is actually quite illogical for agriculture to be problematic for our ecosystems. And so if that's the space we're operating in, then we really need to rethink what we're doing. We've gone really wrong on a few fronts if that's where we're at. And that is where we're at right now, is we are now recognizing, boy, agriculture's problematic for the environment. Surely there's another way we can do this. And so I think one of the things that we want to talk about, and you know, the story of peat that we have on our site is one of the ways that we can tell it, right? You know, when the trucks were rolling in onto that site, you know, over the course of a month, we had 100 double dump trucks a day for a month coming and depositing mineral soil on that site. And I mean, that is crazy. And there are a lot of people that would just, I mean, their bodies would just cringe looking at that, at putting this soil on top of peat. And it is really weird. It doesn't feel like, how can that be the right thing to do? And yet, in the context that we are in this urban context, we have this peat on this site that realistically we could not restore and really rehabilitate that half of the bog. So what was the best thing to do? And I think we do need to let go of some of these ideas of what we think is good and what is bad, and just think, what is the end goal here? If the end goal is to use this land to produce food, to foster a vibrant ecosystem, to make this space really resilient, what do we need to do to achieve that outcome? And it may not be what we've done in the past. And that is part of that discussion that we want to have, is let's not be too tied to the way we've done things, but rather reimagine from a blank slate. Focus on the outcome. What do we need to do? We need to revive these ecosystems that are our food production systems to be more than food production systems. That has been the case in the past. That should be the case now. And so we really want to shift that discussion away from, well, how can we help farmers adapt to climate change, to, no, how can we make farmers the heroes? where agriculture really is a core and central part of how we move forward.
Okay. I'm just really curious, like, how hard was it to make that leap from, because like when I think of conservation, it's very much, like, it was awesome in the past, let's make it awesome right now, but we've talked about it before, that what happened here wasn't so much restoration, wasn't so much preservation, it was creating a new ecosystem, which has brought in wildlife and certain things that that initial step that we're really gonna manage the heck out of this place in a way that some people are not gonna like. How hard was it for you or for the university to take that leap or make that leap?
Yeah, boy, we had some interesting conversations, a lot of discussions over those early days of thinking, do we want to be associated with this? Is this really the right thing to do? And we're really staking everything on this. Yeah, we did not run into this lightly. We had a lot of discussions that went around it. Language is an important part of this too, of how we talk about ecosystems, and conservation and restoration are kind of these really important words and efforts that we tie to sustainability a lot of the time, and think about what is a good thing to do. Well, yes, it's good to conserve and it's good to restore things. Here in our scenario, we're in the middle of a city, and this city has transformed this place completely. It is nowhere near the land that existed before the city was here, and there is no way to go back to where we were at. And there's lots of spaces in our cities and in urban and peri-urban environments. That's often the case where things have already happened, and now this is the context we're in. And so I think it's important to allow ourselves to not be paralyzed by that, because I know for me it was a little bit overwhelming to think about how do we begin to restore? What are we restoring here? How do we conserve? What are we conserving? It's an unhealthy bog right now. Is that what we want to conserve? Nothing was really making sense when you looked at it in that frame, right? And so I think as we sort of went through that process of thinking about, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? Well, we need to think about carbon. We need to think about how we bring more resilience into this system. We need to think about what the community can engage with on this site. And when we started to think about outcomes, then you start to think about, how do I achieve those outcomes? And if you can free yourself from some of those really great words like conservation and restoration, and allow for a new one, creation, to come into that mix, suddenly you're pretty freed in terms of what you can start to do. And the idea of creating a new ecosystem that has never existed on that site. If you come to the KPU farm today, you are coming to a place that has never existed before. It's an ecosystem that was not there 5 years ago. It wasn't there 10,000 years ago. It's never been there. And the ecosystem you come to 20 years from now, we'll continue to build it, and it's going to be dynamic, but it's not what has been there in the past. And yet there's great value to that. And it is, I here in British Columbia, we have a really dynamic community as well. And we see that here too, right? What does our community look like? Well, it looks very different from what it did 20 years ago. And it's going to look different 20 years from now. And people are part of our ecosystem, and just this idea of creating new spaces that are underpinned by all of the same principles that underpin conservation and restoration. Those are not compromised in the process of creation. I think that's really core, is we're not abandoning the principles that sort of are the foundation of that. We're just applying them in a different way, and allowing ourselves to reimagine and giving permission, I think, for communities to really capture a values-based vision where we're going to build something, as long as your foundation is on those core principles around conservation and restoration and ecosystems. That's the heartbeat of what we're doing. So it is, it's a bit of a new box that we're playing in, and it's a really exciting one. And I think, when we imagine what the world looks like, and, I talk to our students about this a lot, that you have no idea what needs to be done 20 years from now. That's part of the challenge of the times that we live in, is it's changing very quickly, and it's changing in ways and bringing us to places we've never been before. And so how do we equip people to just know how to imagine and to know what those foundational pieces are that you can then build on. So I think it's really exciting. It's sort of a neat way to think about how we bring in new ecosystems into some of our urban and peri-urban, and I mean, this applies to lots of different contexts.
Final words of the episode go to Rebecca and her response to my question of why are community partners an important part of the ecosystem at the KPU farm?
Partners are everything. We wouldn't exist if not for the partnerships that we have. So I think when we look at the land, before we were even engaged in this land, there was a nonprofit group here in Richmond called the Garden City Conservation Society. They really were advocating to keep that land that we are now on, the Garden City lands, from being developed. And so there was a lot of discussion in the community after the city had bought the land of what they would do with it. And this group just poured their heart and soul into the conservation of that land as agricultural land. And so we build on what they started, which I think is really important to recognize that we're only here because there were citizens that really felt passionate and gave of their time to save that land and to make sure that it was set aside and not developed. So partnerships have been part of this land story from, before we engaged with it. Yeah. But of course, it's owned by the city now, and that piece of being able to access land, there's no way a university today can buy a piece of land like that. And that relationship that we have with the city has been really important. The other layer of that is because it's with the city, it means that taxpayers in our community are really what is funding us and allowing us to be on that land. And so there's a pretty high demand for accountability that comes with that, which I think is fantastic because it ensures that we're constantly sort of reflecting on, okay, this is good for us, is this good for the community? And it's good for the community. We'll proceed. So every year we actually go to city council and we report to them on specifically what the community benefit is for us being on that land. And I just love that we get to do that, not only because it demonstrates that indeed agriculture should be a benefit to community. There shouldn't be a farm out there that couldn't go to a city council and say, hey, here are the things that I'm bringing to our community. And so to have that platform to be able to articulate that, I think is really neat and demonstrates that this is more than just our project. And that's something that has meant a lot to me, that KPU doesn't own this. We don't, have final say on anything, really. We're constantly in dialogue with community partners in the city. So we wouldn't exist without partnerships. We also work with groups of farmers that have really been amazing at helping us on this journey of, oh man, what do we do here? What are your thoughts on this? And that's been a really powerful piece to have, and to be able to welcome them onto that space. And, a few weeks ago, there was a group of farmers that had a dinner on the site and just had that ability to make it a community space. We also work with other community partners like schools, for example. One of the real challenges we see in agriculture is that most people are not from farms anymore. There's a very small portion of our population that actually is from a farming background. Yeah. And we need a lot of people to grow food. But if you've grown up with a real disconnect from agriculture and food systems, it's really difficult to actually even begin to imagine why it matters, how it matters, where can you connect with it. So partnering with schools is something that I'm really quite passionate about, in making sure that K-12 sector is also engaged in really contemplating what is the role of these agroecological spaces in our cities, in our communities, in how society functions, and being more cognizant of the food that they eat. We're pretty thin and shallow in terms of our relationship with food. For most people that grow up in urban environments, their relationship with food is at the checkout at the grocery store. So we get calls from news agencies to talk about agriculture when food prices go up. That's like kind of the guaranteed phone call you're going to get. Like, oh my gosh, cauliflower is $12. Can we talk about this? And because that's what resonates with people.
Right.
And, you know, that's really tragic that's really the only point of intersect we have with food for most people in our community. Partnering with our schools is so essential to be able to really empower teachers to talk about it. Teachers have a lot on their plate. And so to say, hey, I know you may not know anything about food systems, but you should teach about food systems. That's just absurd to put that on them. So as much as possible, we try and partner together with them to create opportunities of learning. We also work with other organizations like the Richmond Disability Society. We've had a couple immigrant groups that have come to the farm, and that's also really great because you can pull people in from where they're coming from, where you say, oh, what is your food culture and what does that mean to you? And now you're in this new space, and what is our food culture, and how does it mesh with where you're coming from, and how can you actually contribute to our food culture? So British Columbia is a really young place. There's, you know, in terms of what our cities look like today, our Indigenous communities have this incredible food history and food lands, and there's a deep culture there, and we're pretty disconnected from it. So there's so much to learn from there. But we also have people from all over the world that are here that come with all these rich food cultures and histories, and that we can also learn from. And boy, there's a real equalizing component of sitting around a table together. And so when you have people from diverse communities come, one of the ways I think you can really make them feel welcome and engaged in our community is around food. So, you know, working with those communities is a really fun part of it as well. The reality is, when we think of the challenges that face agriculture, here in British Columbia, especially southwestern British Columbia, one of our really tough points of tension is land access, where farmers, we're training all kinds of farmers, but boy, they can't get on land because it's too expensive. Not because it's not there, but just because it's too expensive. So we have some pretty big challenges to face that have dollars and cents associated with them. And that means citizens at large need to be involved in this discussion, because really there is no path forward that doesn't involve engagement from the broader population. You have to have some level of public support for our food system to really be able to transform. It's pretty tough to do that. If you're a politician, you don't generally promote things that people don't know about or care about. So educating our community so that when we have discussions about how do we improve access to land for farmers, how do we really foster the production of food, how do we really build a regional food system, it's going to be really hard to get buy-in if they don't know what you're talking about. And so that's another important part of partnering with like parks and being in community spaces and just fostering these dialogues so that we can actually go to the community and they will say, oh yeah, I have personally experienced why it matters and I understand why it matters. Even though I'm not directly engaged in it, I see how I'm connected to it. So that's a really important piece of it. So when we think of sustainability, relationships is always at the heart of it. And so you really can't talk about sustainability in a meaningful way if you are not also talking about partnerships and relationships. So it's pretty central. It's pretty central to what we do here and will continue to be. We're a pretty small department. There's only 3 full-time faculty. We've got 2 part-time. And yet here we are with this big amazing farm in the middle of town, and it's not because of us, it's because we've been able to partner with other people, and that's really, I think it's really cool. And it makes it more fun too. It's not just us talking to ourselves. We get to work and get those perspectives from just a whole host of people.
Well, there was wondering when you were talking, and I hope I don't sound like a jerk saying this, but like kind of what's in it for the KPU farm to have all these partnerships? Because I get it, like the surrounding community gets a lot out of it because of the education, and even like I heard like a lot of the food gets donated to the food bank too.
Yeah, that's right.
But I was like, well, yeah, what's in it for you folks to have all these community partnerships?
I mean, I guess it gets down to just the values that underlie what we do. This is what we are trying to demonstrate. So sustainability is all about relationships. So we can't teach our students, oh, this is how you grow crops sustainably. If we don't have relationship attached to that, and sort of that humanity is part of this ecosystem, it turns out, we've really fallen short on the task. And to be honest, it like fills my soul. Like I think this is what makes it so enjoyable, is that you get to interact with people, and what we do is better because we have so many different partners that pour into it and that contribute to it. You're always better with more people thinking about something, and the end product, it might take you a little longer to get there, for sure. Yeah, it would have been way faster if we could have just bought the land and built what we wanted, but boy, the story would have been different, right? And it sure wouldn't have, we wouldn't have done what we did. So there's so much in it for us. There's a lot of time where I just think, we're just winning on this, and you know that benefit is enormous. We could not do what we do without our partnerships, and particularly in North American culture, we tend to be very individualistic. Institutions can be quite territorial, you know, a lot of the time, and we want to own things. You know, this is my project, or this is our project, and you know, who's the lead on this, and really nobody really benefits from that kind of approach. So we're trying to demonstrate a different way of operating. And I always think of us as being a community embedded institution, not just community facing, but truly embedded, that if we left, the community would have a problem. If the community pulled out, we would have a problem. You know, that it should be this web that you can't pull on one piece of it without it being felt. That's an ecosystem. That's the way it works. And so we need to be operating that way. And I think that's the goal. We need to operate the way ecosystems operate because we're part of it. And you can't do that without engaging with the partners that are in that ecosystem with you.
When you hear something like that, you can't help but wonder if regenerative agriculture is something society wants to see go big, sharing the risks with agriculture producers might not be quite enough. Society needs to become a partner in this endeavor. Thanks for listening to part 8 of the Stories of Regeneration series. In part 9, we're heading back home to Alberta to talk cows, plant diversity, nutrient density, and how, in a way, agriculture is a reflection of society's values. Be sure to download and listen. Rural Roots to Climate Solutions is an Alberta-based organization empowering agriculture producers and the communities they live in with climate solutions. Rural Roots runs workshops, farm field days, webinars, and participant-driven projects like the Siksikaitsatipi Agriculture Project and the Regenerative Agriculture Lab. We produce a farmer's blog, and of course, we do this podcast. For more information about us and what we do, go to the website, which is www.rr2cs.ca. The rest of the amazing and talented Rural Roots to Climate Solutions team is Cheyenne Younger, Kristen Mountain, Shelley Seed, and Lance Tailfeathers. The podcast is funded by a variety of Alberta-based funders and funders based in other parts of Canada. The Stories of Regeneration project is primarily funded by Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. The project's led by Regeneration Canada, a fantastic not-for-profit organization that advocates for soil health to mitigate climate change and guarantee a healthy food system. It's an organization that Rural Roots is proud to partner with. For additional information, videos, blog posts, digital materials about the agriculture producers featured throughout the series, visit regenerationcanada.org. A big shout out to Antonius, Sarah, Ali, Paige, and Genevieve from the Regeneration Canada team, and Jean-Marc, Phil, and Obed from the film crew, who all worked tirelessly to bring this project to life. It was an absolute pleasure working with you folks. My parts of this episode were recorded on Treaty 7 lands and in the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Happy farming wherever you are in the world. And remember, what's good for the climate is good for the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph or via podcast. And thanks to Regeneration Canada and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions for permission to broadcast this episode. Please join us again next time for another episode of Food Farm Talk.